Thanks a lot for inviting me to present on my most recent research on Russian journalism in exile. I had the unique opportunity to catch the moment when Russian journalists en masse moved from Russia following the start of the war in Ukraine in February 2022. And since I was doing a lot of research on Russian journalists prior to the war, I was very much involved in the research for the last roughly 10 years or so. It was a very interesting experience to see how the sort of traditional way of life is changing. Again, probably everyone on this panel knows that Russia was not the ideal place to work as a journalist. For many years, starting from basically early 2000s, the Kremlin was cutting all the financial resources from the independent media, destroyed the independent media, bought the independent media, turned them into pro-Kremlin media, introduced legislation that would seriously cut the opportunities of journalists to work independently, to raise money, or to reach to the newsmakers. So, for example, the foreign agents law was one of the harshest ones. So, in Russia, up until 2022, despite all these grim circumstances, Russian independent media were still managing to survive for several reasons. Well, first of all, the civil society was not killed completely. I mean, it's not killed yet. Still, there is some pretty strong grassroots movement. So a lot of the members of audience were turning into the patrons, donors, subscribers to independent media, which for some of them was a massive source of money. So up until the war, up until the serious blows to their financial stability, a lot of the Russian independent media were managing to survive. To report, they certainly faced serious challenges, but nevertheless, they operated, and it was only the law that criminalized basically independent coverage of the war in Ukraine. That was passed 1 week after the invasion, made most of the independent media force them to move out, because otherwise they would have ended up in prison. So when they moved again en masse, this was the process basically that stretched from February up until May or June. They received a massive financial support from donors organizations, and it was certainly one of those moments in the history of Russian independent media when the last thing they needed was money. But there were other issues that they faced, which I'm going to cover. So I'm structuring my discussion around 4 issues that I consider the most important in trying to assess the state of the Russian independent media at the moment. So, first of all, the media without audience is media without purpose, basically. So, whenever I spoke to the Russian journalists during my field work, one of the central issues that arose straight from the start of the war was, how do we keep in touch with the audience when we move to exile? As Louisa mentioned, that's one of the key issues for exile journalists. Otherwise, how do you stay relevant? But it was not just the problem, because the war brought multiple issues with censorship, with bubbles, audience bubbles, echo chambers, and biases. Because a lot of those who actually consume information from the independent media before the war gradually moved to either silently support the regime or openly support the regime for various reasons. And the battle for hearts and minds, or opinions indeed, made a lot of the Russian exiled media become very much biased in their reports, even tabloid in style, because they wanted to catch the attention of those who were sort of doubting the independent media content, but at the same time were sort of on a shaky position whether to support the regime or not. Interesting enough, what Russian independent media reported in the interviews was that they couldn't really say that all their audience is very anti-war. What they've noticed is that the massive shocks to the political system, like the invasion, like partial mobilization in September 2022, which brought hundreds of thousands men to the front line, actually triggered incredible interest to the content of the Russian media, which basically says that Russian audiences, no matter who they are, no matter what kind of position they occupy, they actually know about the existence of the independent media, and whenever they want and need, they actually go and check what they have. But the exile also allowed a lot of the Russian media to refocus from the Moscow-centric agenda that many of the independent Russian media had prior to the war to the last Moscow-centric audience. So they looked more into the regions. They looked more into the agenda of what ordinary Russians there outside of Moscow actually suffer, because most of the issues related to the, let's say, partial mobilization or dead soldiers from distant regions in Russia, they actually came from the region. So they actually wanted to have this, the attention of those people outside of Moscow, in hope that they will become their core audience. And some of them actually succeeded. Then another issue was funding, although indeed a lot of the funding was coming from the donors, and money was the last thing they really were worried about in the last couple of years, up until actually end of 2023. The funding applications were one of the trickiest things, because a lot of the exiled media had no experience of getting funding from donors. So another problem was that a lot of this donors funding was only partial or very short periods. They were funding specific projects for, let's say, 3 months. But when you move outside of Russia, when you don't have property, when you don't have stable salary, you had to somehow juggle different projects, which caused a lot of journalists to burn out. And the circumstances in which journalists get paid for their work in the European Union, for example, put the extra sort of pressure on them, because new laws, new taxation also made a lot of journalists sort of freak out about their conditions of work. So one of the major issues that independent media in exile reported to me in the interviews is that we really need core funding. However, the being in exile helped them to find new ways of making money. So some of them started opening new media outlets, find new advertisers, especially for those who worked abroad, for example, in the Baltic states, where the Russian diaspora is quite big. Third issue is technology. And we would have thought that the big tech would have helped Russian independent media in the context of the massive invasion to Ukraine. But almost everyone in my interviews reported that the big tech, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, they actually managed to ban a lot of the content from independent media. For example, the atrocities of the Russian army reported in Instagram were banned by Instagram, because Instagram is a media about joy, not about atrocities. However, in Russia, Instagram audience is one of the highest. So that could have been a great source of access to new audiences, especially those audiences who were doubting the Kremlin narrative. And another issue was that Kremlin's cyber censorship was working quite well. And it managed, in the first several months of the invasion, managed to cut off those audiences that the independent media really wanted to get. However, despite that, Russian exiled media managed to use various opportunities, like, for example, promoting VPN technologies across the Russian audiences, involving them into into their sort of sphere of influence. And finally, from the organizational point of view, it was probably another issue that worried a lot of journalists. The legal status abroad, because Russian laws and Russian intelligence were influencing a lot of the post-Soviet countries like Georgia or Kazakhstan. So there was no way to hide there or operate there freely and independently. There was always the threat of having issues with the law, even being deported back to Russia and end up in prison. So a lot of the journalists moved to the European Union, where almost none of the governments, aside of the Netherlands and Germany, provided long-term visas for those journalists. In general, the hubs of the Russian exiled media were the Baltic states, but the Baltic states government and societies were not really welcoming to the influx of Russian journalists, and that created a lot of tensions for the staff members of those media in exile. Not to mention that some of the respondents told me that their staff members were actually, their colleagues were actually getting sort of more pro-imperial, pro-Russian while being in exile. So that created quite a lot of problems, and potentially created a lot of problems for those who planned to stay in the European Union for a while. Plus, visas guaranteed and provided by the governments of the Baltic states also were not guaranteed for a long time. Many of them were given for 1 year, and then they expired, and then the changes in the local domestic agenda of the states or the elections or whatever, they actually influenced on the decisions of prolonging the working visa for the Russian media in exile. So as a result, what we have at the moment, things haven't changed for good. And what I see now from the conversation, and I'm running another workshop for exiled media this weekend in Berlin, and I'll have a chance to check with them. But what we still see as major problems is the lack of core funding. Still, journalists cannot plan for a long period of time. They still struggle to access the audiences inside Russia. And the more they work in exile, the less they can access new audiences in Russia. Russian domestic audiences are getting more sort of closed from the new information or from independent information. And finally, there is no solution to the visa issue. So a lot of the journalists are still sort of up in the air, held up by these legal constraints. And they are getting more depressed, and they are getting the environment there is getting quite gloomy. So I guess this is some of the present problems for many of the media professionals, and certainly they could be the key of challenging the political regime. But there are some of the problems that could be resolved from the outside, by European or American stakeholders, but they seem to be ignoring this issue. Thanks a lot, and happy to answer any of the questions.